What if the person chosen to save a nation was not a king, not a general, and not a powerful noble, but a teenage girl from a tiny village who could neither read nor write? What if that girl claimed she could hear voices from heaven? And what if those voices told her that the fate of France rested on her shoulders? Most people would dismiss such a story immediately. Some would laugh. Others would call it madness. Yet more than 600 years later, the name Joan of Arc remains one of the most famous names in history. Not because she was born into power, not because she inherited a throne, but because she dared to believe she could change the impossible. To understand Joan's story, we must first step into the world she lived in. And it was a world filled with fear. France in the early 15th century was suffering through one of the darkest periods in its history. The Hundred Years' War had dragged on for generations. Entire regions had been devastated by conflict. Villages disappeared, crops failed, families fled from violence. Everywhere people looked, they saw uncertainty. For ordinary citizens, life was a struggle. For the kingdom itself, survival was far from guaranteed. English armies controlled large portions of French territory. Political divisions weakened resistance. Rival factions fought among themselves while enemies advanced. Many people believed France was slowly dying. Hope was becoming a luxury few could afford. It was into this troubled world that a girl named Jeanne was born around 1412 in the small village of Domremy. Her family were farmers. They were not wealthy. They were not influential. Like countless other villagers, they spent their days working the land and trying to survive difficult times. Nothing about Joan's childhood suggested she would become famous. Nothing suggested kings would one day seek her advice. Nothing suggested armies would follow her into battle. By every expectation, she should have lived an ordinary life and vanished into history unnoticed. But history often changes when least expected. According to Joan, everything began when she was around 13 years old. One day she heard a voice, then another, and another. Later, she would describe these experiences as messages from heavenly figures sent to guide her. The voices carried a purpose. France must be saved. The rightful king must be crowned. And somehow, she had been chosen to help make it happen. Imagine hearing such words as a young teenager. Imagine believing that the future of an entire nation depended on you. The responsibility would have terrified most people. In truth, it frightened Joan as well. At first, she kept much of it to herself. But the voices continued. Days became months. Months became years. The messages never disappeared. Instead, they grew stronger. So did her conviction. While war consumed the kingdom around her, a different battle was unfolding inside Joan's heart. One path offered safety. Stay home. Remain silent. Live an ordinary life. The other path offered uncertainty, danger, and almost certain ridicule. Yet it was the second path that called to her. Eventually, Joan reached a decision that would alter history forever. She would leave her village. She would seek out powerful leaders. And she would tell them something almost impossible to believe, that a peasant girl from nowhere had been chosen to save France. Most people would have called it a dream. Others would have called it madness. Joan called it her mission. And soon she would begin a journey that would transform her from an unknown village girl into one of the most legendary figures the world has ever known. Leaving her village was only the beginning. The real challenge was convincing anyone to believe her. Joan was not a noble woman. She had no military experience, no education, and no connections to powerful people. In the eyes of society, she was simply a farmer's daughter from a remote village, someone easy to ignore, someone easy to dismiss. Yet Joan refused to accept that. She believed her mission was real, and she believed France could still be saved. The journey ahead was dangerous. The kingdom was divided by war. Roads were filled with uncertainty. Enemy forces controlled large areas of the countryside. Traveling alone could mean robbery, imprisonment, or death. But fear did not stop her. Step by step, Joan moved farther away from the only life she had ever known. Along the way, she met people who questioned her claims. Some laughed openly. Others accused her of seeking attention. A few believed she was simply confused. Yet every challenge seemed to strengthen her determination. The more people doubted her, the more firmly she held to her purpose. Eventually, Joan reached Vaucouleurs, where she sought support from local authorities. At first, they rejected her. The idea sounded ridiculous. A teenage peasant girl claiming divine guidance and demanding an audience with the future king of France? Most people would have ended the conversation there. Joan did not. She returned. She argued. She insisted. Again and again. Her persistence began to attract attention. People expected uncertainty from someone her age. Instead, they encountered confidence. People expected fear. Instead, they found conviction. Slowly, attitudes began to change. Some still doubted her, but others became curious. What gave this young girl such certainty? Why was she willing to risk everything for a mission that seemed impossible? Eventually, supporters agreed to help her continue her journey. It was a small victory, but it changed everything. For the first time, powerful people were beginning to listen. After a difficult journey across dangerous territory, Joan finally reached the court of Charles, the Dauphin of France. At the time, Charles desperately needed hope. His claim to the throne was uncertain. His kingdom was fractured. Military defeats had damaged morale. Many doubted whether he would ever become king. Into this atmosphere of uncertainty walked a teenage girl who claimed she had been sent to save the nation. According to tradition, Charles decided to test her. He disguised himself among members of his court while another man occupied a more prominent position. When Joan entered the hall, she moved through the crowd and approached Charles directly. The moment left many observers stunned. Whether every detail happened exactly as later stories describe remains debated by historians. What cannot be debated is the impression Joan made. She impressed the court. She impressed Charles. And most importantly, she convinced influential people that she deserved a chance. Still, extraordinary claims required investigation. Church officials questioned her carefully. They examined her beliefs, motives, and character. They searched for signs of deception. Instead, they found remarkable confidence. Joan answered difficult questions calmly. She never abandoned her story. She never retreated from her claims. Finally, Charles made a decision that shocked many advisors. He would give Joan a chance. Soon, armor was prepared. A horse was provided. A banner was created. The peasant girl from Domremy was about to ride toward history. Ahead of her stood Orléans, a city surrounded by enemies. A city many believed was doomed. And a city where Joan of Arc would begin transforming from an unlikely dreamer into a legend. When Joan arrived at Orléans in the spring of 1429, she entered a city living under constant fear. For months, English forces had surrounded it. The siege had tightened like a rope around the city's throat. Supplies were running low. Food was becoming scarce. Every day brought new uncertainty. Every night brought new anxiety. People inside the walls wondered how much longer they could hold on. Many believed the fall of Orléans was only a matter of time, and if Orléans fell, the consequences could be catastrophic. The city was one of the most important strategic positions in France. Its loss would strengthen English control and deal a devastating blow to French morale. The kingdom had already suffered years of defeat. Another disaster could break it completely. Into this desperate situation rode Joan of Arc. She was only 17 years old. 17. Surrounded by hardened soldiers, experienced commanders, and men who had spent their lives studying warfare. On paper, she should have inspired little confidence. Yet reality proved very different. From the moment she arrived, people noticed something unusual about her. She carried herself with certainty. Not arrogance, not recklessness, certainty. While others spoke about survival, Joan spoke about victory. While others focused on fear, she focused on hope. And after years of defeat, hope was something France desperately needed. The defenders of Orléans began listening. So did the soldiers. Joan visited fortifications, encouraged troops, and appeared wherever morale was weakest. Her presence alone seemed to lift spirits. Men who had expected another defeat started believing that success might actually be possible. That belief changed everything. Because wars are not fought only with weapons. They are also fought in the mind. Soon, French forces began launching aggressive attacks against English positions surrounding the city. Joan did not remain safely behind the lines. She moved close to the action. She carried her famous white banner into dangerous situations and remained visible even when fighting intensified. Again and again, she placed herself where the risk was greatest. During one fierce assault, disaster nearly struck. An arrow hit Joan. The wound was painful and serious. For a moment, many feared the worst. The young woman who had become a symbol of hope collapsed from the injury. News spread quickly through the battlefield. Some soldiers worried that everything was over, that perhaps the miracle had ended. But Joan refused to stay down. After receiving treatment, she returned, wounded, exhausted, but still determined. When soldiers saw her reappear, carrying her banner once again, a surge of energy swept through the French ranks. If she could keep fighting, so could they. The attack intensified. Pressure mounted on the English defenses. Position after position began falling. Momentum shifted. What had once seemed impossible suddenly looked achievable. Then came the breakthrough. Key English fortifications were captured. Their defensive network started collapsing. The siege that had trapped Orléans for months was finally breaking apart. The English withdrew. Orléans was saved. The victory sent shockwaves across France. People who had lost faith began believing again. Soldiers celebrated. Church bells rang. Citizens poured into the streets. For the first time in years, the kingdom had something it desperately needed, a reason to hope. And at the center of that hope stood a teenage girl from a farming village. Almost overnight, Joan became more than a military figure. She became a symbol of courage, a symbol of faith, a symbol of resistance. But fame can be as dangerous as defeat. Because while ordinary people celebrated her victories, others were beginning to watch her rise with growing concern. And some of the enemies Joan would face next were not wearing English armor at all. The victory at Orléans changed everything. For years, France had been trapped in a cycle of defeat, fear, and uncertainty. Entire generations had grown up believing that English victories were inevitable. Every battlefield seemed to bring another setback. Every campaign seemed to end in disappointment. Then Joan arrived, and suddenly the impossible happened. Orléans survived. The siege was broken. The enemy retreated. What made the victory so powerful was not only the military result, it was the psychological impact. For the first time in years, people believed France could actually win. News traveled quickly across the kingdom. Villagers spoke about Joan around fires at night. Merchants carried stories about her from town to town. Soldiers repeated tales of her courage in military camps. With every retelling, her reputation grew. Some called her a heroine, others called her a miracle. Many believed God had sent her to save France. Whether those beliefs were true or not mattered less than their effect. People were inspired. Hope was returning, and hope can be one of the most powerful forces in history. Following the victory at Orléans, French forces continued their campaign. Momentum had shifted. The army that once fought with uncertainty now advanced with confidence. Joan pushed constantly for action. She believed hesitation would only give the enemy time to recover. Again and again, she urged leaders to keep moving forward. Her confidence influenced those around her. Commanders who once doubted her now found themselves benefiting from the morale she created. A series of French successes followed. Each victory strengthened the growing belief that the tide of war was finally turning. But Joan's greatest objective was not simply winning battles. It was placing Charles on the throne as the rightful king of France. For Joan, this was central to her mission. A king needed legitimacy. And in medieval France, legitimacy came through coronation. The traditional coronation city was Reims. The problem was that reaching Reims would require moving through dangerous territory. Many advisors considered the plan too risky. The safer option was to remain where they were and protect recent gains. Joan disagreed. She argued that caution alone would never save France. The kingdom needed a symbol. The people needed a king. Eventually, her determination prevailed. The march toward Reims began. As French forces advanced, something extraordinary happened. Several towns opened their gates with little resistance. Communities that might once have opposed Charles now welcomed him. The momentum surrounding Joan seemed unstoppable. The closer they came to Reims, the more people sensed that history was unfolding before their eyes. Then, in July 1429, the moment finally arrived. Inside the great cathedral at Reims, Charles was crowned King Charles VII of France. For supporters, it felt like a miracle. For Joan, it represented the fulfillment of a promise she believed had guided her since childhood. She stood nearby holding her banner, watching the ceremony unfold. The peasant girl from Domremy stood beside a king, a scene that should never have been possible. Yet it happened, and for a brief moment, Joan stood at the height of her influence. She had helped save Orléans. She had inspired a nation. She had helped place a king on the throne. It should have been the beginning of a glorious future. Instead, it marked the beginning of a new danger. Because victory creates attention. Attention creates jealousy. And not everyone celebrating Joan's success was happy to see her rise. Far from the battlefield, political tensions were already beginning to gather around the young heroine, and soon those tensions would prove far more dangerous than any English army. After her capture, Joan of Arc entered a battle she could not win with courage alone. There would be no cavalry charges, no victorious armies, no cheering crowds, only prison walls, interrogations, and a carefully planned effort to destroy everything she represented. Her captors understood something important. Joan was more than a military figure. She was a symbol. As long as people believed in her, they could continue believing in France. That made her dangerous. English authorities and their allies wanted more than her imprisonment. They wanted to discredit her, to erase her influence, to transform a national hero into a public warning. The weapon they chose was a trial. Officially, the proceedings focused on religion and her claims of divine guidance. In reality, the outcome seemed increasingly predetermined. Joan faced experienced church officials, legal experts, and powerful authorities. She was a teenage prisoner with no formal education. The imbalance was overwhelming. Yet something remarkable happened. Again and again, Joan answered questions with intelligence, composure, and confidence. Many of the men questioning her expected confusion. Instead, they encountered determination. They expected fear. Instead, they found resilience. For months, the trial continued. Pressure mounted. Isolation deepened. Every day brought new attempts to force a confession or undermine her credibility. Joan stood largely alone. The king she had helped place on the throne did not come to rescue her. The nobles who had benefited from her victories remained distant. The nation she had helped inspire could do little to change her fate. History can be cruel in that way. Sometimes the people who give everything receive very little in return. Eventually, the verdict arrived. Joan was found guilty. The sentence was death. She was only 19 years old. 19, an age when most people are just beginning to discover who they are. Yet Joan had already altered the destiny of a kingdom. On May 30th, 1431, she was led to the marketplace in Rouen. A crowd gathered. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to celebrate. Many came to witness the end of a legend. The executioners prepared the stake. The flames were ready. For a brief moment, the future of Joan of Arc seemed clear. A young woman would die, and her story would end. But history had other plans. As the fire rose around her, Joan's enemies believed they were destroying her influence forever. Instead, they were doing the opposite. They could kill her body. They could not kill what she had become. Years later, the tide of war continued turning against England. France survived. The kingdom Joan fought for endured. Even more remarkable, opinions about her began changing. Investigations revisited her trial. Witnesses spoke. Evidence was reconsidered. Eventually, the verdict that condemned her was overturned. The woman once branded a criminal was declared innocent. Centuries later, she would be recognized as a saint. The transformation was extraordinary. A peasant girl became a soldier became a prisoner became a martyr, and a martyr became a legend. Yet the greatest twist of Joan's story is not how she died. It is how she won. She never defeated every enemy. She never lived to see the final outcome of the war. She never enjoyed the rewards of victory. But she gave her people something stronger than armies. She gave them belief. And sometimes belief changes history more powerfully than any sword ever could. That is why, centuries after the flames disappeared, the name Joan of Arc still burns brightly across history. Not as a victim, not as a mystery, but as the girl who changed a war,